ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਿਆਰ ਭਰੀ ਸਤਿ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਅਤੇ ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਨੂੰ। ਅੱਜ ਮੈਂ ਸਾਡੀ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ, ਸਾਡੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਕੌਮ ਅਤੇ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਦੱਸੂੰਗੀ। ਮੈਂ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੀ ਹਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਗੋਰੇ ਲੋਕ ਸੁਣਦੇ ਹਨ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਜਾਵੇ ਸਾਡੀ ਕਈ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਕਹਾਣੀਆਂ ਹੈਗੇ ਨੇ। ਮੈਂ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੀ ਹਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਜਾਵੇ ਕਿ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀ ਜਦੋਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਬਜ਼ੁਰਗ ਇਸ ਦੇਸ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਆਏ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ ਇੱਕ ਅਜਨਬੀ ਬੋਲੀ ਲੱਗਦੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਸੀ। ਗੋਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਪਤਾ ਹੋਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਕਿ ਸਾਡਾ ਦਿਲ ਵੀ ਦੁਖਦਾ ਸੀ ਜਦੋਂ ਸਾਡੀ ਮਾਂ ਬੋਲੀ, ਸਾਡੀ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ, ਸਾਡੇ ਚੰਗੇ ਕੰਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਦਿਸਦੇ ਸੀ, ਨਹੀਂ ਸਮਝ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਸੀ, ਨਹੀਂ ਸਿੱਖਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀ। ਸਾਡੀ ਪੰਜਾਬੀਅਤ ਜਾਂ ਮਾਂ ਬੋਲੀ ਹੋਵੇ ਜਾਂ ਤਸਵੀਰਾਂ ਹੋਵੇ ਜਾਂ ਲਖੀਤਰਾਂ ਹੋਵੇ, ਇਸ ਦੇਸ਼ ਦੇ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਵੀ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ। ਪਰ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਪਤਾ ਹੋਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਲੋਕ ਗੋਰਿਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਵੀ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਸੀ, ਇੰਡੀਜਨਸ ਲੋਕ, ਸਾਡੀ ਜ਼ਿੰਮੇਵਾਰੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਮਜਬੂਰੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਦੁੱਖ ਤਕਲੀਫਾਂ ਸਮਝੀਏ। ਨਾਲੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਸਮਝਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਲੋਕ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਆਏ ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਹ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਜਾਤ ਕਰਕੇ ਆਏ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਆਪ ਦੀਆਂ ਵੀ ਜਾਤ ਕਰਕੇ ਅਗਲਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਦੁੱਖ ਵੀ ਪਹੁੰਚਾਏ। Hello everyone, to all the listeners. My name is Sharanjit Kaur Sandhra, or Sharn for short, and my talk today is titled Racialized Histories and Archival Erasures, South Asian History in British Columbia. I began by speaking a few short sentences in Punjabi, my mother tongue, my heritage, my past, my present, and my future. Why did I do this? For the majority of speakers listening to me today, I assume that many may be white, of European descent, Anglo-Saxon heritage. I wanted you to feel, understand, and embody for a split second the feeling of not knowing, of not being part of a conversation, of being ignored, of listening to a foreign dialogue, an alien dialogue, an oral archive. This is what many peoples of color and settlers to Canada felt, have felt, and continue to feel through systems of power and privilege, preference, and hierarchies. And yes, this is the same for when we look at the archive. The making of the archive, what constitutes an archive, who creates the archive, how the archive is accessed, and the language of the archive. This is what I'll be speaking to you all about today. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the unceded territory of the Stalo peoples, the people of the river. I want to acknowledge the ongoing activism and resiliency of my Indigenous sisters and brothers who have been fighting in many different ways and in many different forms, systems of oppression. I want to acknowledge that ongoing protests continue in the United States for Black Lives Matter, and just because media isn't highlighting it anymore, it doesn't mean it's not happening. Finally, I want to say that as we all continue to navigate worldwide pandemic, and for some of us, the start of the fall term, semester, back to school, that we do all of this with anti-racism and anti-oppression and a desire for change in our minds, our spirits, and our hearts. I'm recording this talk on Sunday, September 13th, one day after the Globe and Mail released an article about racism at the Royal Museum and Archives from the bravery and experiences of Lucy Bell, a former leader on Indigenous collections and repatriation at the RBCM. Lucy, I want you to know how much I and so many others support you. We believe you. We know that racism exists at the RBCM and other white spaces, and we're sorry that unsilencing this has had to come at the cost of your own career in that space. The fact that the board chair claimed in the article that they were unaware of the existence of racism within their own organization is an incredibly infuriating response, and we want white leadership to know such responses will not be tolerated anymore. So my talk today was supposed to be in person, but of course that is no longer possible. So I ask that you bear with me as I record this talk while switching back and forth from sharing my screen presentation to the web browsers. Hopefully this all can be a smooth and seamless flow of conversations and visuals. Finally, I'm not a trained archivist, nor do I fully understand the archival world, the technology involved, the jargon involved, the processes involved, etc. I am a historian, however. someone who is doing her work and research looking at critical race theory and the museum. So much of my work involves the archive, critiquing the archive, and changing the archive. And so hopefully I can encourage many of you within your organizations to do the same. So I'm just going to share my screen here. I want to begin by rereading from a specific part in my BC Museums Association webinar from back in June, and when I spoke about the archive. I feel it's a great jumping off point to continue the conversation here, now, and with this audience. In my BCMA talk, I read out 10 calls to action for museums in particular, but certainly this is relevant to archives and archival organizations across Canada. In my 5th call to action, I said the following. I'm fully aware of the controversy and pushback and debates around the BC Provincial Archives being closed. But can I tell you that I don't give a shit that the archives are closed? Can I tell you why? The archives is an obsession with the English written word. The archive is an obsession with artifacts and objects and collections that are embedded within the history of colonialism, white supremacy, and in museums through the white gaze and white privilege. We are so tired of hearing that our stories don't exist, that our experiences don't exist because the archives aren't there for us. Because let me tell you, they do. We as BIPOC organizations have to spend thousands upon thousands upon thousands of our own funds and utilize hours upon hours upon hours of our own time and emotion, whether earned through grants or otherwise, to forcefully interject ourselves into your all-white archives. Your white archives haven't even granted us the humanity of naming us. We are the Nameless, which is a brilliant title that I take from my dear friends and colleagues of the Nameless Collective podcast, Milan, Paneet, and Naveen. If you don't know what it is, I suggest searching it up now. Because it's the exact example of what BIPOC communities have to do just to be acknowledged piecemeal in your white historical memory. And who decided that archives should only be in English? Who decided that only the English language mattered in the archives? Who decided this? You did. Your institutions did. Where are experiences of Chinese Canadians in the late 19th century in the archive and in their own words? Where are they? And who's been hired within the archives to sustain that amazing piece of needed knowledge? And even when an archive does name us, it's spelled wrong. So we have to do triple the amount of work to retrace those pasts. Timothy J. Stanley, who discusses scholars writing about Canada's history, says, in discussing the early history of Canada, it justifies exclusive reliance on European accounts on the grounds that written records are necessarily more reliable than oral histories. Its subsequent focus is almost exclusively on Europeans, their reasons for leaving Western Europe in the early modern period, the progress of European discovery and settlement, the road to Confederation, and onwards. It ironically essentializes Europeanness. It is as if once Europeans arrive in Canada, they are frozen in time. Meanwhile, the Aboriginal society, which until the 19th century were the majority population in Canada, and which continue to occupy much of its landmass, are reduced to minor roles. After an initial account of Aboriginal societies, the history refers to Aboriginal people only insofar as they interact with Europeans and European purposes. So for example, their roles in Fur Trade Society or in the Riel Rebellion or Elijah Harper's blocking of the Meech Lake Accord. Although both First Nations people and Black African Canadians appear as the subjects of white racism, they are not discussed either as active participants in colonial society in their own right, or as peoples whose exclusion was integral to shaping that society. The official archives play an incredible role in this erasure, but also in a homogeneous understanding of the BIPOC communities that do exist within the archive. That is a problem with the archive, and we are trying to reclaim our namelessness through work being done, like the Nameless Collective, and other organizations like with us at the South Asian Studies Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley. And we have to find our own means to do so. So what does that mean for those of us who are listening to this talk today? What can be done with the resources that you have and with the work that you were dedicated to doing in becoming our ally? So that's right, to do the work, you must become an archival ally. In his article titled Constituting an Archive, the brilliant Stuart Hall said in 2001, "It is impossible to describe an archive in its totality. The very idea of a living archive contradicts the fantasy of completeness. As work is produced, one is, as it were, contributing to and extending the limits of that to which one is contributing. It cannot be complete because our present practice immediately adds to it, and our new interpretations inflect it differently. An archive may be largely about the past, but it is always reread in the light of the present and the future. And in that reprise, as Walter Benjamin reminds us, it always flashes up before us as a moment of danger." I cannot believe how incredibly perfect this passage from Hall is, especially when given the moment of danger we are living in. We are living in a moment of danger in terms of racial awakening, challenging every system around us possible when it comes to race and anti-racism and oppressive systems. We have to continue to keep the archives active. We have to continue to shape and reform the archives that we have in our possessions and in our purview. Let me provide some examples with the context of South Asian Canadian histories here in BC and some of the work at the South Asian Studies Institute. The image that I used for my talk, that you can now see, which has these official details and descriptions from the city of Vancouver. It says, one photograph, black and white, of a man worshipping inside the Khalsa Dewan Society Sikh temple. The bearded man is wearing a dark-colored turban, glasses, a dark-colored collared shirt, and white pants. He is sitting with a large book open in front of him. The book is propped up on a surface that is covered with shiny textiles. There is a white wall in the background that has two framed pictures on it. Now, here is what is wrong with this description and why it matters. Firstly, the man's name is of course important. Was he one of the earliest Granthis at the West 2nd Avenue Gurdwara in Vancouver? Would he have been involved in the struggle for the right to the South Asian vote, which our community had re-attained only a year earlier from when this image was taken? Or did he fight for the rights for women from India to immigrate to Canada? His name would have revealed all of the interlinking components of our history. Secondly, and perhaps most important, is the random naming of the book that is open in front of him. This is not a book. It is the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji, the epicenter, the core knowledge, the guide, the everything to followers of the Sikh faith. When we enter a Gurdwara, we bow before the text because of the incredible beauty, knowledge, and poetry that it contains, contributed by each of the 10 living Sikh gurus, as well as contributed by those of other faiths, but who upheld the values of Sikhism. That is the context missing. That is the weight of the change in word from book to Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji. Not Sikh Bible, not Sikh holy text, but Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji. At the South Asian Studies Institute at UFB, where I work as coordinator, we are constantly writing and rewriting our histories based on new information about our archives. The rewriting is a decolonized approach to a historical method, one that doesn't hold on to a legitimized past, but one that is always being reimagined, rehistoricized, and reshared. As an example, we recently received a BC Historical Federation grant. Through this grant, we are reimagining, through oral history work and reimagination, the voices of Sikh women who have been omitted in the early BC Sikh settler archives. So these portraits that you see in front of you are part of the Sassy collection. The man on the very left is Gurbaksh Singh Dhaliwal, our local resident Abbotsford Sikh settler. You'll notice that when collecting South Asian archives, there are many portraits like this, especially if you go earlier into the 20th century, and they're often all male portraits because women didn't begin arriving in larger numbers until after the 1920s and really the 1930s. And so these portraits are incredible. But we realize that women's stories are so critical to our shaping of our history in this province, and we need to hear them. Here's an example of a later picture from the same man, Mr. Gurbaksh Singh Dhaliwal, and you'll see his wife, Brit Mohinder, next to him, their children, and his mother, who's the matriarch in the family. We are creating our own archive, our own image, much like what Sikh Heritage Month Manitoba did, with this mind-blowing recreation of one of the most iconic images of Sikh migration and settlement to BC. So this image is based on the City of Vancouver archives, and I can stop and show you just some of the details around where that exists. So you're looking at the City of Vancouver archives and where the original image exists. The title proper is View of the 400 block Granville Street from West Hastings Street. And here you will see an image that has really impacted me in terms of a reimagining, a recreation, and certainly the embedding of women in this historical archive. With the use of one grant that isn't a large amount, $5,000, we at the South Asian Studies Institute, SASI, are rewriting an omitted history of South Asian women settlers in British Columbia. And we are also repurposing the art and photography to bring us into an artistic present, one that will engage with BIPOC youth and future leaders. Our project, through the archives, will be displayed at the Sikh Heritage Museum, become its own archive through our South Asian Canadian digital archive that we are currently working on, and be shared on social media, the ever-burgeoning tool and living archive of the future. What would it look like to reread this image, for example? Posted by the Golden Museum and Archives and our dear colleague, Colleen Palumbo, with the following description based on the Facebook page that reads, quote, in 1917, His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, arrived in Golden to decorate Lieutenant James Beaumont with the Military Cross, which he earned at Vimy Ridge. Lieutenant Beaumont, after twice being buried by shell explosions, led his company forward after all the company officers were killed and wounded, end quote. And that's from the Facebook page. What if, instead of focusing on the imperial narrative of whiteness and colonial power, we shift our attention to the Sikh man, where the arrow is pointing under, omitted, sidelined, and whose presence is erased? A Sikh man in Golden, BC in 1917. Golden, BC, where until this very day, the remaining Sikh community there, as well as non-Sikh community, continue to assert that in fact, their town was home to the very first Gurdwara in all of British Columbia, and by extension, all of North America, and not Vancouver. Could this man have been a clue to that amazing historical knowledge? And to the credit of Golden Museum and Archives, they have employed the same method of highlighting the margins that we did, which was amazing to see. They put those photos up in their own exhibit and pointed out the Sikh man, discussing who they thought that he could be. Also of note, Golden Museum worked with the local Sikh community to put on this exhibit. This is telling. When heritage institutions partner with their communities on heritage work, the result is that we get representation that is actually diverse and meaningful. Michel Rolfe-Trio, in his book, Silencing the Past, Power and Production of History, writes that silence has entered the processes of historical production at 4 crucial moments. The moment of fact creation, the making of sources, the moment of fact assembly, the making of archives, the moment of fact retrieval, the making of narratives, and the moment of retrospective significance, the making of history in the final instance. In every single part of these silencing moments, which all ends in the making of history, it has been through white power and privilege. But that doesn't mean that the BIPOC histories and productions of history do not exist. It's a matter of reconfiguring and finding those processes by BIPOC experiences and through BIPOC experiences. And so my calls to action to you all listening today is to restore racialized balance in the work that you do from this point on. One in which you have to focus on your local BIPOC histories to counterbalance the hegemony of whiteness. Certainly this can be done. The access points exist for you to get access to these archives, but first you also need to build the meaningful relationships to do so. That is a strength that BIPOC organizations naturally have with each other. even with other BIPOC communities outside of our own. Our shared solidarity through those narratives of not belonging in white spaces actually strengthens our resolve with each other. As an ally, your organizations need to come to a similar space. But of course, hiring BIPOC in permanent positions with the knowledge of those BIPOC communities is also a part of the process. Once again, to take a piece from my BCMA talk, I said this in my third calls to action. When you, meaning heritage organizations, museums, archival organizations, etc., get grants to do digitization work, for the love of God, just stop spending more time and energy digitizing white settler European histories. We've got plenty of that, thank you very much. Build your archives and knowledge about your local BIPOC communities. Spend those grant funds to interview BIPOC elders in your community. Pay those knowledge holders. Honor those knowledge holders. Perpetuate and share those stories within your own communities to show your actual investment in the work. Display them on your social media. Display them on your websites and platforms. I don't care if it takes years and years of you doing this until that community begins engaging with you. You have centuries worth of colonization and racism to account for. So yes, it's going to take time. I would add now, in hindsight from this talk, and after having worked with an amazing archivist at the SASI, Jasmine Hundle, who is currently working at the Cambridge Archives in the United Kingdom. Through Jasmine's work with us at the SASI, we all learned just how difficult it was to navigate and find archives of Sikhs and South Asians, even when the archives exist. This is because BIPOC are very rarely the focus or main subject of material in the historical record, unless it is about them through a white, often colonial gaze and as a cause for consternation. Therefore, we have to find alternative ways to spot them, such as looking at the margins of the photos, like in the Golden BC example, considering where their lives and the law intersect, so intersecting with voters lists, tax registers, and casual mentions in council minutes, and screening the historical accounts of the more privileged for passing mentions of us, so through white diaries and oral histories of white settlers. According to Jasmine, quote, on this note, when I was looking for us in the margins through online databases, I found us in archives like Cowichan and Golden. When I found Sikh men at the very edge of photographs in Golden's collections, it felt like such a triumph, end quote. Just stop and show an example now of the Cowichan Valley Archives database. Jasmine goes on to say, quote, I remember that with Cowichan Museum and Archives, I did what I do with most archives. I go through everything they put online. They've organized their photos by theme and subject. And even though they had a section titled Ethnic Communities, there were only 2 photos under it. Because I knew that Baldi and its history falls under their jurisdiction, 2 photos just seemed way too low of a number. Also, BIPOC are more than just ethnic. We are also people who participate in sports, in religion, in parks, in politics, in art, in culture, in food, in industry, in farming, in businesses, and so on and so forth. Therefore, it just made more sense to check all of their themes and subjects. And what do you know? I found us under many other subjects, end quote. We are once again very lucky to have a wonderful and meaningful relationship with the Cowichan Archives. And so this is a chance for us to work towards change through the archive and within those organizations. And we know that Cowichan has a really beautiful, meaningful relationship with Baldi that has been built over many, many years. And so that's a wonderful access point for those conversations and the changing of the archives to begin. To those communities, archives, museums, and heritage societies who have some collections of their BIPOC communities, I would suggest that those collections be given their due space and accessibility. Because even your search categories erase us by default. The terminology changes, which is part of those racialized categories that continue to keep us and our histories inaccessible. You as archivists or heritage workers or museum professionals or digital web designers or communication and marketing folk can change the way access about BIPOC histories can be found. While Jasmine worked with us at the SASI, she also created an amazing Google map locating all the various sawmills in British Columbia and sawmill towns. So this is what Jasmine created. It's not public. It's currently just shared with the SASI, and it will be part of our South Asian Digital Archive putting forth publicly. Why is this important, you ask, in terms of archives and South Asian stories? Because these towns each have the potential of storing incredible stories of early 20th century archives as it relates to South Asians, but also Chinese, Japanese, Indigenous, and perhaps other BIPOC communities who worked within this industry. There's potentially an incredible untapped storytelling and archive that begins with a mapping. The SASI hopes that it can begin these conversations within specific communities and archives and collections to create the connections in place to allow these stories to come to life. I want to end my talk today with an example of how powerful a counter archive, a counter voice that is not decided through a white gaze and process like Trio describes can be. So many of us know the story of the Komagata Maru. It's the one microcosm of a story that we now finally learn in school. It is a story of denial, power struggle, colonialism, gatekeeping, and so much more. But have you ever thought that Gurditt Singh had his own version, had his own story? Gurditt Singh, the Hong Kong merchant and businessman that charted the ship? Well, he does. But here is the story that we most often learn from the perspective of colonial powers and administrators. So this amazing archival database is the Komagata Maru journey.ca. And if you haven't accessed this or making use of it in terms of the South Asian settlement histories in British Columbia, I highly recommend you do. It's an incredible resource for students, for educators, for community professionals to look at this. So this is just one small example of the colonial gaze in the colonial archive. The document is titled Malcolm R.J. Reid, Dominion Immigration Agent, to William D. Scott, Superintendent of Immigration, page 3. Subjects include Edward J. Bird, who was the lawyer hired on behalf to represent the passengers of the Komagata Maru, Reid, Malcolm R.J., William D. Scott, Singh, Hernam, and Winnemac. It is located within the Library and Archives Canada, and it's dated May 23rd, 1914. The day that the Komagata Maru ship landed on the shores. Here's what the passage says. Letter that Mr. Good had left for home. On the 22nd instant, I sent you the following night lettergram, which I now beg to confirm as follows. Komagata Maru with 376 Hindus, including 2 women, arrived at quarantine last night. Dr. Nelson, quarantine officer, has declined to issue pratic on grounds that the ship has not bill of health from Moji, Japan. He is taking this up with the Department of Ottawa. Will you take up situation in consultation with his department in view of technical point raised? Imperative that government patrol boat be delegated to keep this vessel under surveillance in view of attempt to land surreptitiously en route or in harbor at Vancouver, where I intend, if possible, to keep her in stream and conduct necessary examination there. I'm proceeding Vancouver. Please advise their naval patrol boat has not yet reported for orders. We drove all night by auto, leaving Victoria at 3:20 a.m. After 3 hours, we reached the outer wharf, and Dr. Milne, several immigration officers, proceeded by launch to quarantine at Williams Head, being met en route there by Dr. Nelson on the gun hilt. And so on and so forth. A large launch loaded with Hindus was circling the vessel all the time. The leader and spokesman of the party endeavoring to address the passengers of the Komagata Maru being Hernam Singh, once deported but who returned to Canada. And then he references, of course, those details, which the surveillance systems within Canada at that time, of course, would have had. This is an example, and it's one of thousands upon thousands of pages of examples through a colonial immigration white lens and gaze. But what was Gurditt Singh's perspective in this moment? I will share with you. Here's what Gurditt Singh said, based on a biography that he wrote in Punjabi and has luckily been translated as well. Just having issues. Let's try that again. Okay, so this image I just want to talk about briefly is actually quite heartbreaking when you read the more nuanced histories of the Komagata Maru story, of course. It's heartbreaking because you see jubilation on the faces of these men. You see success. You see a sense of joy and overcoming. And within this power struggle, you see them see that they think they've won. But of course, we know that is not the case. And for those who know those histories really in depth, you know eventually what happens when these men who are forced to return to Kolkata, the violence they face. But what did Gurdit Singh say? On page 61 from the translated book of his biography, titled India's Slavery Abroad, he said this: "But what about the Indians, who are said to be British subjects protected by their benign government? They have no consul of their own to represent them there. Serfs at home, they are treated no better than helots abroad. What most grievously hurt them was that Indians living in Canada had sent for their wives and children who purchased tickets up to Hong Kong, as there was no direct steam service ship to Canada, and thence to Canada. When they were about to land, the Canadian government stopped them and ordered to return back to Hong Kong. Pause for a moment to imagine the heartrending scene on the docks. Fathers had come to receive their children, husbands had come to receive their wives, but the Canadian government's brutal order stood between them. To sigh and shed tears in silence was all they could do. Those on board had spent their last farthing to reach Canada, where the protection and help of their relations and friends awaited them, and the order passed by the Canadian government threw them into utter destitution. Can anything be more tragic and brutal?" So here Gurdit Singh is talking about the continuous journey regulation, which ended up being leading up to the Komagata Maru challenge to that regulation. He's talking about separation of families. He's talking about hope and desire to move. He's talking about support and interracial, intercommunity solidarity that is hindered by the Canadian government. He's talking about destitution, and he's talking about Indians at the time who were under colonial rule continuing to be serfs in their own homeland and being treated like serfs and being treated less than in India. He's talking about so many things, and he does this throughout his biography. He talks about it from a perspective of anti-colonialism. But this is the angle that you don't see when you continue to read the archives through Canadian immigration archives and through archives of a colonial white gaze. You are missing the affect, you are missing the emotion, you are missing the lived experiences of those who were on board the ship or of those who tried to charter the ship and create a business venture out of bringing passengers and people from India to Canada. That is the incredible part that you are missing through a white gaze only archive. That is the nuanced histories that is missing. Gurdit Singh's biography offers an entire counter-narrative to the archives upon archives upon archives of the colonial archive gaze in terms of the Komagata Maru, but also incredible systems of surveillance in British Columbia and Sikhs and South Asians. These are the sorts of counter-archives that we need to bring forth and highlight and teach and make easily accessible through the channels we have. Now is the time. Please, let's not delay. And with that, I'm going to stop my presentation, and I think there'll be time for Q&A with me live. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharn. That was a thought-provoking presentation and some really clear calls to action. We have Sharn here live to join us for a question and answer session, which is going to be moderated by the Friends of the BC Archives President, Kelly Black, who is, I can also see him there on the screen. If you have questions, please put them in the chat.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Sharn.
You're
I'm
welcome.
wearing my shirt today, Museums
Oh,
Are
I
Not
need that.
Neutral.
I need that.
It should also say Archives Are Not Neutral.
Yeah, that's
And
great.
just while people might be getting some questions together, I just wanted to say thank you, and so much to consider and to work on in what you've said. I'm struck particularly by that image that you posted, the sort of remixed version of the archival image, which was really amazing.
Yeah.
And how this idea of an artistic present, access and knowing that these people and stories can be found in the archives if the work is done, is just so very important, to be able to take for communities to be able to take images, for example, and use them. And so things like licensing restrictions and that kind of thing are obviously important to work on. But as you said, you know, communities such as South Asian community, you know, don't give a shit because, and I can completely understand, you know, such a fair thing to say because, as you said, archives haven't been there for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. And I think sorry, go ahead, Sharon.
I think, you know, one of the points I'm trying to make is the archives are there as well. But if the onus is really on these organizations who have potentially a corpus of kind of hidden, erased collections and bringing forth those collections. And you're right, like that Sikh Heritage Manitoba image was from a year ago. And to this very day, I continue to look at that picture and I get charged electric. And I don't know why. There's something about kind of a reimagining of the archive through an artistic gaze by young people. And what it's showing me is that young people, Kelly, are drawn to the archives. I don't know if you see on Instagram and on social media, there's like this resurgence of just archive images being thrown out everywhere. And it is young people who are like, wow, there's something nostalgic, but there's something about this recreation. So I think there's something really exciting happening where archives is coming out in an artistic present. That's what excited me about that Sikh Heritage Manitoba image. It was like this recharge, whereas archives used to be seen as something boring potentially, or something only devoted within a specific discipline. What I'm seeing now is that archives have the utmost potential.
Thanks, Sharn. Shanae in the chat asks, what was the biggest challenge in finding depictions of history from an Indian point of view?
It's not challenging for us, luckily, because those of us in our organization know the Punjabi language at least. With our new South Asian Canadian Digital Archive, we're expanding the notion beyond Punjabis to be inclusive of other South Asian communities in British Columbia. So certainly that's going to be more of a challenge in the way that we have to now tap into many other communities and relationships and partnerships of other communities, South Asian communities, to say, you know, who are the knowledge holders in your communities? What oral histories do they have? And when you start reaching out and you enter people's homes, it's a treasure trove. Like, it is truly a treasure trove of things that people have and they don't even realize how valuable it is. And our methodology is that we're not taking a single thing from anybody. What we're going to do is digitize it. We're going to find a way to create an etch in time of whatever your archive is, but it's yours to keep with you forever. But we're going to make it accessible. So for the Punjabi community in particular, because that's my community, that's my directors' communities, we have those connections. But I think it's going to be more of a scoping and venturing out into various other South Asian communities for the work that we have ahead.
Thanks, Sharn, and thanks for the question. Two more questions in the chat that I think are important, particularly around how can non-historians, maybe people who don't spend a lot of time in or with archives, help towards the kind of things that you've talked about, and then how do we get beyond this idea of siloing that you've mentioned in the archives or in historical narratives?
So I'll just look at the first question. You absolutely do not have to become a historian to help make archives more robust. And I think that's why I was saying that there's a new movement where young people are actually using archives in their own professional spaces and in their own artistic, graphic design, marketing, communications, like public relations. I feel like archives are becoming this access point to our traces in the past, but using it in the present moment. And that's why I really liked Stuart Hall's quote, which was this idea of let's continue to reshape the archives. If today our world is everything social media related, all right, cool. Let's use the archives we have and what can we do in terms of social media access? So certainly, no, you don't have to be a historian. Those youth who made that Sikh Heritage Month, they're not historians. They're young professionals who thought, there's a really cool Vancouver picture, let's recreate it and make this our brand. And they made it into a whole entire brand, which has been really successful there. So in fact, it opens up the possibility when you don't limit it to just historians. And then just looking at the second question, I think organizations have a lot of potential to not silo histories and how they categorize their archives. And, you know, back to Jasmine's point about, I think you need to go back and see when you have Indigenous, Black people of color embedded within your archives, are they relegated to only, you know, South Asians or Sikhs or Japanese or Chinese or etc.? Or is there a way you can embed them throughout many different thematic subsets so that you're not siloing them as only being like an ethnic group, right? BIPOC peoples are so much more than their ethnicity. They're embedded in our entire history in this province and country as well. So unsiloing it is really going to be pulling those archives you have in your collections and seeing how you can help promote them. I also feel, back to social media, how you showcase what your organizations do is really important. If you continue on your websites, on your Facebook pages and Instagram, Twitter, whatever you're using, to only showcase a homogeneous monolith, very white European settler imagery, that's what you're going to get in terms of your human connections and your community connections, right? Because people are going to say, well, that space isn't for me, clearly, because they continue to do the same thing. But why not totally reverse it and only show BIPOC imagery? Like, why not say we are dedicated to this work? And I guarantee you, people will start coming to you and saying, oh, my grandpa or my great uncle or my great aunt or my grandmother was in the community. Is there potential for us to archive their history? So how you expose these stories is really important. Don't bury them, showcase them.
Thanks, Sharn. While you maybe read the next two questions that are there,
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add an example of what you're talking about. In my research, I was doing some research for an exhibit about the history of Victoria's water supply, and we came across documents related to the payroll for building a water pipeline that lists Hindu labor, full of names and wages and everything. But that wasn't categorized under ethnic communities or whatever. It was just water. But it also wasn't directed that these people were mentioned in the document. And so we came across it by accident. But that's, I think, where descriptions and subject terms can help people, as you're saying, find these things, but also not silo it as it's only about water or it's only about Sikh labor or that kind of thing. So
yeah, absolutely. And you know, even the point about how you find brief mention of communities through these cross sections of like meeting minutes or diary entries. It's like you'll randomly be reading something and boom, you see something that's obviously clearly, you know, Hindoo, Hindu, which means Sikh. And so it becomes a whole a can of worms to that piece of history potentially in that community. And that's what Jasmine found when she was doing the work for us.
Arjun has a question about nomenclature and using the term South Asian.
Yeah, I'm just looking at that question. this is an ongoing question. So I know where Arjun's going because the SASI just received a grant from the provincial government to continue to do our work, and it's through many different projects, one of which is the Digital Archive. Originally, our project was called Punjabi Canadian Legacy Project, and Punjabi refers to a very specific linguistic, geographical area in northern India and also parts of modern-day Pakistan before partition. So it was easy to be able to know when you say Punjabi, what you're referring to. I always find it difficult to interchange between Punjabi, Sikh, and South Asian. And I can understand how people are also confused that I perhaps am interchanging those words, because South Asian refers to an entire kind of massive geographic space and opens up to other parts of South Asia, Afghanistan, Burma, South India. Like, it's a massive geographic space. But that's part of our growth as an organization to say, the foundation of our history in terms of British Columbia is Sikh. The first settlers to come to British Columbia in 1897 were Sikh settlers. That is our foundation. But in the 70s and 80s and 60s onwards, perhaps, there has been vibrancy and growth of other communities who've come from South Asia. So it's important that we honor and share those oral histories and stories. And it's important that somebody begin doing that because it has been very Punjabi-centric. And so our work foundation is going to be Punjabi Sikh because that's what the archives are, but we're going to expand beyond that and look to other communities in British Columbia. And it's very important to do that, to create those solidarities I mentioned about different BIPOC communities. We want them to know that your histories matter as well.
Thanks, Sharn. Shanae has another question, and if there are other people out there with questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And this one's about building trust with communities and people so that they're open to sharing their stories and perhaps their archives as well. And I know you touched upon that in the talk, that maybe I think you said maybe you'll be sharing a picture every day on social media of a BIPOC community, and it might take years. And I think that's a very good reminder, but I don't know if you want to expand at all on
Sure.
Shanae's question.
I think now more than ever, this question of allyship and trust is really important. And it's so great that organizations are having these philosophical conversations, because I don't think it was given a lot of weight, let's say a year ago. Right? But of course, we're living in a very different world now. And so organizations are wanting to step up and become allies. So I think you do need to build trust. And trust sometimes, I truly think that trust can only happen if you have the staffing who are from that community. It really is important. And, it's controversial for me to say that. And I want to make it clear, not everybody will agree with me. Totally fair. Even other Punjabis, other Sikhs may say, well, we don't agree with you, which is totally fine. But my belief really is you need to hire the professionals in your spaces from a community to engage a community, because there's a certain click we just get when we communicate with each other. When we call, in the Punjabi context, somebody I don't know, a stranger, an auntie and uncle ji. They're immediately my auntie and uncle, but they're a stranger to me, right? But that's because Punjabis have this relational aspect of our communication, relationship building. So I do believe you need to hire the professionals, and you need to harness their growth as well. Through those professionals, you are going to build longevity relationships, and then you're going to be able to collect more archives and imagery and access points, just like Cowichan has done with Baldy. Catherine, who runs the Cowichan Valley Archives, everybody in the Baldy community knows Catherine by her name. She's always at the Gurdwara. They're always engaging with each other. That, to me, is a model of success. Colleen at the Golden Museum and Archives, same thing. Every Sikh who still lives in Golden knows Colleen. She's always got her doors open. There's always communication. That, to me, is successful. And in those spaces, they don't necessarily have the hires, because there's literally only like one person working there, right? It's a very small organization. But I do believe hiring is important. Marketing, marketing, marketing is the world we are living in. Market yourselves as such. You know, whatever space you can, and marketing can be free, right? It's free Facebook posts, it's free Instagram, Twitter posts, beyond the labor of the person who's behind there doing that work. So certainly there are ways you can navigate and create true allyship. I give really convoluted long answers, Kelly.
No problem. I think they're long, complicated questions that are multifaceted. So I think that's all right. There's a question from Kyle about what does the collection of archival and oral histories look like in practice. I don't know if that's something you want to answer, or if Kyle wants to expand on that. And Jack Bryden sent me a message privately, but was asking if there's a list of 20th century BIPOC within the context of Canada newspapers available. So maybe like a starting point for some of this research.
I'm looking at Kyle's question first. So he's talking about the inclusion of oral history. So what does the collection and archival of oral histories lack in practice, or look like? It looks like he's saying lack in practice.
Look like, I think. What does it look like in practice?
Okay, look like in practice. I think that's very heterogeneous. I don't think there's a homogeneous one way to engage with oral archives. I do think it may depend on the community, right? So for Punjabis, for Sikhs, for example, we are a very oral-driven community. Our speech, the way we engage with each other, is through telling of stories. Many people are uncomfortable in having themselves recorded sometimes. So how can you create a safe space where people are being recorded if they don't want to be recorded? So for some, we don't put their videos or actual oral interviews online, but we create narrations, and we offer those narrations in conjunction with a beautiful kind of window of archives and imagery. Sometimes that is enough to create a very powerful experience for the person who's looking at these stories. Some are comfortable with having their video and oral interviews online. So it's just a matter of having the digital tools to make those accessible. I do find nowadays people don't want to sit and listen to hours upon hours of oral interviews and videos. People want sound bites. So once again, it's that kind of marketing world we're living in, where people just want quick access to information. So it may be that you create powerful sound bites of these oral archives and video archives and make them accessible. So for us, we've done an interchange of both, where we just offer the narration and the imagery, or we actually do make the video with subtitles if needed online as well. And there was, the question you got about the newspapers. The Komagata Journey website that I showed you has a list of Punjabi newspapers. So in the early 20th century, there were Punjabi language newspapers being published out of British Columbia, Swadesh Sevak, and there were a few others as well. I think they may have been in English too sometimes as well, both in Punjabi and English. The Komagata Journey has done an incredible job of digitizing all of these. I would love to know if I'm pretty sure like there were Chinese language newspapers. Would it be Mandarin, or what the word would be? I'm sure there were Japanese language newspapers. In fact, what a great question, and what a great project to collect these newspapers if others haven't done them already. I'm wondering if the Nikkei Museum has maybe already done this work, if other museums have done this work. But I think translation is really important, because then you see both. You see the original mother tongue language, but you see the English translations as well. So I'm quite certain they do exist. I would look at the Nikkei Museum, look at the Komagata Journey, and perhaps, I don't know who would have it for other communities. They do exist, certainly.
One good spot for that is university library websites, Jack, to your question. Often they create library guides for various departments or faculties, and often there are I know where I teach at VIU, there's a lib guide being the term, for historical newspapers, and it breaks out some of the ones that are, for example, in VIU's collection, or that are publicly accessible, not through the university. so they have First Nations newspapers, for example.
Mm.
So could be a good place to start, for example.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, Sharon. Jesse on our board, Jesse, who's running some of the tech for us, thanks, Jesse, asks, I think, a really important question that all of us face working in heritage organizations is the reliance on some organizations of volunteer support. And any thoughts you might have, Sharn, about how organizations that are run primarily by volunteers go about reaching out to BIPOC communities without taking advantage of their time or unpaid labor?
That's such a good question. I'm kind of grappling with that myself, because I'm trying to figure out the platforms that we are given nowadays, if that's actually more important now as a free source of access point, if you see what I'm saying. So for example, I gave a talk for RBCM at home last week, and it was free. It was my time, giving my time, but I used that moment to say very powerful things about everything that's happening at the RBCM, right? And I was like, this is great. I've been given a platform and I'm going to use this platform. So I'm kind of beginning to teeter from this idea of everything is, I have to be really careful. I don't mean this as a definitive answer, but everything has to be paid, and you have to equate money as a value tool, as opposed to a platform that is being given. So if there's a volunteer-driven organization that has incredibly limited resources, maybe only one permanent staff and everything else is volunteer-based, my answer would be, if you're going to reach out to these communities, you need to guarantee them some sort of platform. You need to guarantee them that whatever knowledge you're going to take from them, that you're going to do something with it, right? That you're going to continue to keep in communication with them. So it's not just their knowledge being taken and then you do it what you want to do. So that's part of that community building. I'm really beginning to think there's potential for really powerful platforms and exposure through moving away from everything being driven as money, if that makes sense. I don't know if that answers Jesse's question. So I do think it is possible. I think it is possible if you promise that you're going to do something with that knowledge.
I think that's a great start, Sharn, and I know as a volunteer-driven organization ourselves, that's something that we constantly talk about for inviting speakers like yourself, and how we share this knowledge. And many people have asked if this talk will be shared further, and we're going to talk about that and work out how we might do that. So for those of you who are interested, please just stay tuned to the FBCA social media or sign up for email updates, and we'll have more on that soon.
Great.
Jesse says thanks. Thanks, Jesse, for the question. And I'm not seeing any other questions, but I'll draw it out for another 10 seconds here. If people do have a question they want to type in the chat, but Sharn's pretty good at this Zoom digital talk thing. And Sharn, you mentioned your BCMA webinar, which was really excellent, really powerful. And if people on this event are interested further and in more detail about the kinds of things that Sharn's talking about, they should definitely go to the BC Museums Association webpage, and I believe they've made that webinar available to the public, and definitely something worth checking out.
And if I can plug the
Please.
BCMA conference that's coming up, I'm moderating a session. It's going to be pretty powerful with Lucy Bell, Armando Perlo, and Denise Chong, who are going to be talking about their experiences. So Armando was one of the people who spoke out about the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. Lucy Bell, as we all know, was a leader of Indigenous collections at the Royal BC Museum, and Denise Chong was one of the curators at the exhibit A Seat at the Table, which is currently at the Canadian Chinese Museum. So I'm really pumped about that panel. So and it's a free session, so people can sign up for that as well.
Good plug. Thank you, Sharn. And